Frank Morrison's weathered hands froze mid-reach for his morning coffee, the ceramic mug slipping through trembling fingers as something beneath the skin of his neck pulsed with violent, alien movement. It wasn't just the arthritis pain he'd been hiding from Sarah for months. Something was alive under there. The mug shattered against the linoleum floor, sending scalding coffee across his bare feet as he stumbled backward, his reflection in the kitchen window revealing a grotesque bulge writhing beneath his collar. Mrs. Patterson's horrified scream pierced through the thin walls from next door, her morning walk interrupted by the sight of her neighbor clawing desperately at his own throat. Sarah burst through the unlocked front door, her nurse's training forgotten as she witnessed her proud, stubborn father collapse against the refrigerator, tears streaming down his face as he whispered the words that would haunt her forever. "It's been growing inside me for 50 years." The 911 operator's voice crackled through Sarah's trembling phone. "Ma'am, what exactly is moving under his skin?" What had Frank been hiding all these decades, and how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, when the summer heat still promised hope and the neck bump was nothing more than a mosquito bite that wouldn't heal, Frank Morrison had convinced himself that 75 years of hard living had finally caught up with him. The steel mill had closed its doors forever that spring, taking with it the last remnants of Millfield's industrial soul. But Frank's calloused hands still ached for the familiar weight of his welding torch. His modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street bore the scars of a man who'd spent 50 years pouring every dollar into someone else's dreams. The kitchen faucet dripped a steady rhythm that Martha used to say sounded like a heartbeat. But now it just reminded Frank of all the repairs he couldn't afford. Canned beans had become his dinner companion most nights, the same brand he'd eaten in Vietnam when the world was younger and death felt like someone else's problem. Sarah Morrison Chen carried her own invisible wounds through the fluorescent-lit aisles of Peterson's grocery, where she'd been scanning barcodes since her nursing license expired and her marriage imploded in the same devastating month. Her ex-husband David had left her with twin 8-year-old boys, a mountain of legal bills, and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into your bones. Jake and Tommy spent their after-school hours with elderly Mrs. Patterson, drawing pictures of dinosaurs, while their mother worked her second job cleaning the law offices that had handled her divorce. At Millfield Family Clinic, Dr. Rebecca Hayes was finishing another 16-hour day, her stethoscope heavy around her shoulders like a chain of responsibility she'd never learned to carry gracefully. She'd given up her cardiology residency in Minneapolis when her father's heart attack brought her home, trading the promise of prestigious hospitals for a cramped clinic where the waiting room chairs were held together with duct tape and hope. Her 12-year-old daughter Emma ate dinner alone most nights, homework spread across the kitchen table like a puzzle missing too many pieces. The three of them moved through their separate struggles like planets in different orbits, unaware that Frank's small neck bump would soon pull them into the same gravitational field. Millfield had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, but lately people had been turning inward, protecting what little they had left from neighbors who might need more than they could give. Frank's house held 50 years of memories with Martha, from the faded wedding photo on the mantelpiece to her reading glasses still folded on the nightstand. He'd mortgaged everything to pay for her cancer treatments, watching their savings evaporate like morning dew while he smiled and told her not to worry about money. Now, 3 years after laying her to rest, he was discovering that love's most expensive lesson isn't how much you're willing to spend, but how much you're willing to hide from the people who love you back. The neck bump was getting bigger, and Frank's pride was running out of places to hide. Father's Day weekend arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made everything stick to your skin, including secrets that had been buried too long. Sarah loaded Jake and Tommy into her dented Honda Civic, their handmade cards for Grandpa Frank carefully protected in a manila envelope that had seen better days. The boys chattered excitedly about showing him their latest Pokemon cards, oblivious to their mother's growing concern about the man who'd been dodging her phone calls for 2 weeks. Frank had spent the morning trying to mow his front lawn, but every pull of the starter cord sent lightning bolts of pain through his neck. The bump had grown to the size of a golf ball, hidden beneath his favorite flannel shirt, despite the 80-degree weather. When he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, the asymmetry of his neck made him look like a man carrying invisible baggage, which wasn't far from the truth. "Grandpa, why are you wearing a winter shirt?" Tommy asked the moment he bounded through the front door, his 8-year-old directness cutting through adult pretenses like a knife through butter. Jake, always the more observant twin, noticed how their grandfather kept rolling his shoulders and rubbing the left side of his neck. "Just catching a chill, boys," Frank muttered, avoiding Sarah's increasingly suspicious gaze. "Your old grandpa's blood isn't what it used to be." Sarah had inherited her mother's intuition and her own nursing background, a dangerous combination when it came to detecting medical evasions. She watched Frank wince as he bent to hug the boys, noticed how he favored his left side when he walked, and felt her stomach tighten when she glimpsed something unusual beneath his collar line. "Dad, what's that on your neck?" she asked, while the boys were distracted by cartoons in the living room. "Mind your own business, Sarah," Frank snapped, his tone sharper than he'd intended. "Back in my day, we didn't run to the doctor for every little ache and pain." But Sarah had learned to read between the lines of her father's stubbornness. When she offered to help him bring lemonade to the boys, she deliberately positioned herself to get a better look at what he was hiding. What she saw made her trained nurse's instincts scream in alarm, a large, discolored protrusion that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "Dad, that's not normal. You need to see someone about that." "I need to mind my own business and let my body handle what it's been handling for 75 years, Frank shot back. But his voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself as much as his daughter. The argument escalated when Sarah discovered the stack of unpaid medical bills hidden beneath a dish towel in the kitchen drawer. Bills from Martha's final months with red "past due" stamps that told the story Frank had been desperate to hide. The outstanding balance was staggering, $47,000 in medical debt that Medicare hadn't covered, plus interest that had been compounding for 3 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's voice cracked with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "I could have helped. I could have done something." "With what money?" Frank's facade finally crumbled. "You're working 3 jobs to keep your own head above water. You think I don't know you're behind on your mortgage? You think I don't see how tired you are, how thin you've gotten?" The truth hung between them like a toxic cloud. Frank had been eating 1 meal a day to save money, cutting pills in half to make prescriptions last longer, and ignoring every symptom because he couldn't afford to be sick. Sarah had been so consumed with her own financial struggles after the divorce that she'd missed the signs of her father's quiet desperation. "I can't afford to get sick, honey," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I won't watch this family lose everything because of me. Not again." Tommy wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the unusual sound of adult voices raised in conflict. "Why is Mommy crying? Why does Grandpa look sick?" The innocent question shattered whatever composure both adults had been clinging to. Frank knelt down to his grandson's level, the movement sending visible pain across his features, and tried to smile. "Grandpa's just tired, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups get tired and need to rest." But Jake, the observer, pointed to Frank's neck with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Grandpa, you have a really big bump. It looks scary." Sarah knelt beside her father, her hand gently touching the swollen area. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt something that would haunt her dreams. The bump moved, not the natural give of swollen tissue, but something deliberate and alive beneath the skin. Frank's eyes filled with terror as he met his daughter's gaze. For the first time in 50 years, he looked truly afraid. Tuesday morning arrived with the cruel indifference that accompanies life-changing moments. Frank had spent a sleepless night pacing his small kitchen, the neck bump throbbing with a persistence that made him wonder if this was how Martha had felt during those final weeks when the cancer spread faster than hope could follow. He'd made coffee at 4 a.m., his hands shaking not from age but from a fear he couldn't name, watching the sun rise over Millfield's empty Main Street through his kitchen window. The lawn-mower sat in his garage like an accusation. He'd promised himself he'd finish the yard work before Sarah came back with more questions he couldn't answer. But when he pulled the starter cord, the vibration sent such a sharp pain through his neck that he stumbled backward, knocking over Martha's ceramic planters that still held her favorite petunias. Mrs. Patterson was hanging laundry on her clothesline when she heard the crash, followed by a sound she'd never heard from Frank Morrison in 40 years of being neighbors, a cry of genuine distress. She rushed to the fence line just in time to see him collapse against his garage door, both hands clutching his neck as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. "Frank! Oh, my Lord, Frank!" she called out, her arthritis forgotten as she hurried toward him. But Frank was beyond hearing her voice, lost in a wave of pain so intense it felt like lightning traveling through his nervous system. Mrs. Patterson's call to Sarah interrupted a particularly difficult morning at Peterson's grocery, where Sarah was trying to explain to her manager why she needed another afternoon off to deal with family issues. The panic in the elderly woman's voice cut through Sarah's professional composure like a blade. "You need to come now, honey. Something's wrong with your father." Real wrong. Sarah found Frank sitting on his front porch steps, conscious but disoriented, his face pale and drawn in a way that reminded her too much of how Martha had looked during the bad days. The bump on his neck appeared visibly larger than it had been just 3 days earlier, and when she knelt beside him, she could see something that made her nursing training kick into overdrive. The skin around the growth was hot to the touch and beginning to show signs of infection. "Dad, we're going to the hospital. No arguments." For once, Frank didn't protest. The fight had gone out of him somewhere between the garage floor and the realization that whatever was happening to his body was beyond his ability to ignore or endure in silence. The ride to Millfield General Hospital passed in tense quiet, broken only by Frank's labored breathing and Sarah's whispered prayers. Dr. Rebecca Hayes was finishing her morning rounds when the Morrison family arrived in the emergency department. She recognized Sarah from their children's school functions, but it was Frank who caught her attention. The way he held himself, the careful protection of his neck, and something indefinable in his eyes that reminded her of old photographs she'd seen in her father's military albums. "What seems to be the problem today, Mr. Morrison?" Dr. Hayes asked, her professional demeanor masking the alarm she felt when she got her first clear look at the mass protruding from Frank's neck. "He's been hiding this from everyone for months," Sarah answered when Frank remained silent. "It's gotten much worse just in the past few days." Dr. Hayes' initial examination revealed what her experience told her was far from ordinary. The mass was firm but yielded slightly to pressure, and when she palpated the area around it, she could feel Frank's entire body tense with pain. More concerning was the heat radiating from the site and the beginning signs of systemic infection. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you some questions about your medical history. Have you ever had any injuries to this area? Any surgeries? Any foreign objects that might have been embedded in your neck?" Frank's silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Vietnam," he said simply. "Took some shrapnel near Da Nang in '68. Army docs said they got it all out." Dr. Hayes felt her pulse quicken. Her father had served in Vietnam, had come home with his own collection of scars and stories he'd never shared. She'd seen enough military medical records to know that "got it all out" was often more hopeful than accurate. "We're going to need some tests," she said carefully. "Blood work, imaging studies. I want to get a clear picture of what we're dealing with." That's when the hospital's billing coordinator appeared with the clipboard that would change everything. The estimate for a full diagnostic workup, including the specialized imaging Dr. Hayes was recommending, came to $18,000. Frank's Medicare would cover basic emergency treatment, but the extensive testing needed to properly diagnose and treat his condition fell into a gray area that insurance companies loved to dispute. Frank stared at the numbers on the paper as if they were written in a foreign language. "Then I guess I'll go home and die there," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd already calculated the cost of living versus the price of leaving his family in debt. "Dad, no." Sarah's voice broke. "We'll figure this out. We'll find a way." But even as she said the words, she was doing her own desperate math. Her mortgage was already 3 months behind. Her credit cards were maxed out from the divorce. The boys needed school clothes and winter coats. There was no way to find $18,000, much less the additional costs that would certainly follow. Dr. Hayes watched this exchange with growing recognition of a story she'd seen too many times in rural medicine. Good people forced to choose between medical care and financial survival. But something about Frank Morrison's case was pulling at memories she couldn't quite place, connections that felt important in ways she didn't yet understand. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe, each revelation peeling back another layer of the Morrison family's carefully maintained facade. Dr. Hayes had insisted on keeping Frank overnight for observation, despite his protests about the mounting costs, and what she discovered during that first night would haunt her professional conscience for years to come. The ultrasound results arrived at 3 a.m., delivered by a radiologist whose 20 years of experience hadn't prepared him for what he was seeing. Dr. Hayes studied the images in the harsh fluorescent light of the nurse's station, her coffee growing cold as she traced the outline of what appeared to be a metallic object completely encased in scar tissue and surrounded by an angry infection that had been spreading slowly for months, possibly years. "Rebecca, you need to see this," called Janet Morrison, the night nurse who'd been monitoring Frank's vitals. His fever had spiked to 102.3, and the mass on his neck had grown visibly larger since his admission. More alarming was the redness spreading down his shoulder and across his collarbone, classic signs of cellulitis that could quickly become life-threatening if not aggressively treated. Sarah had spent the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her father's bed, dozing fitfully between his fever-induced episodes of delirium. During one particularly disturbing episode around 4 a.m., Frank had begun speaking in what sounded like military code, calling out coordinates and names she'd never heard before. When she tried to wake him, he'd grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them know about the shrapnel. They'll take away my benefits." The morning brought a parade of specialists conducting telemedicine consultations from Minneapolis and Rochester, each one confirming Dr. Hayes' growing suspicion that Frank's case was far more complex than a simple infected cyst. The infectious disease specialist recommended immediate surgical intervention, while the trauma surgeon expressed concern about operating on a 75-year-old man whose overall health had been compromised by months of untreated systemic infection. Meanwhile, word of Frank's mysterious illness had begun spreading through Millfield's tightly knit community with the speed and distortion that only small-town gossip could achieve. At Peterson's grocery, customers whispered theories about everything from exotic diseases to government cover-ups. Some longtime residents remembered Frank's strange behavior after returning from Vietnam, how he'd kept to himself for months and refused to talk about his service. Sarah's absence from her 3 part-time jobs was already creating ripple effects she couldn't afford. The grocery store manager had been understanding for exactly 1 day before reminding her that there were plenty of people looking for work. The cleaning service had simply replaced her with someone more reliable, and the catering company had stopped returning her calls altogether. Each lost shift represented money she didn't have for hospital bills that were accumulating by the hour. At home, Jake and Tommy were staying with Mrs. Patterson, who was doing her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy while fielding questions from worried neighbors and well-meaning church members. The boys had begun acting out in ways that alarmed their elderly caretaker. Jake refusing to eat anything but peanut butter sandwiches, Tommy waking up from nightmares about his grandfather dying like Grandma Martha had. Doctor. Hayes found herself working longer hours than usual, not just because of Frank's complex case, but because something about his military background was triggering memories of conversations with her own father. Lieutenant James Hayes had served in Vietnam during the same period as Frank, and she'd grown up hearing fragments of stories about the men who'd saved each other's lives in ways that bonded them forever. Her father's sudden death from a heart attack 5 years earlier had left many of those stories unfinished. But she remembered him talking about a Marine named Morrison who'd carried wounded soldiers to safety during the Tet Offensive. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable for everyone involved. Frank's Medicare had covered the basic emergency room visit and 1 night of observation, but the specialized testing and surgical consultation were falling into coverage gaps that could take months to resolve through appeals. The hospital's billing department was already generating estimates that ranged from $75,000 to $150,000, depending on what complications might arise during surgery. Sarah found herself in the hospital chapel at 2 a.m. on the second night, staring at a wooden cross and trying to remember the last time she'd prayed for anything other than making it through another day. Her mother had been the religious one in the family, the one who'd believed that everything happened for a reason and that God never gave you more than you could handle. But sitting in that empty chapel with her father fighting for his life 1 floor above, Sarah couldn't help but think that God had seriously overestimated the Morrison family's capacity for suffering. The breaking point came when Frank regained consciousness long enough to understand the full scope of his medical situation. Doctor, Hayes had been as gentle as possible in explaining that the object in his neck was likely a piece of shrapnel that had been overlooked during his military medical treatment, and that removing it would require major surgery with significant risks. "How much?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse from the fever and medications. When Dr. Hayes reluctantly shared the financial estimates, Frank's reaction was immediate and devastating. "Stop everything. I'm going home." "Dad, you can't," Sarah pleaded. "The infection will kill you." "Better that than destroying what's left of this family," Frank replied, with the stubborn dignity that had defined his entire life. "I won't be the reason my grandsons lose their home. I won't be the reason you lose everything Martha and I worked for." The argument that followed brought nurses running and attracted the attention of other patients' families in the corridor. Sarah accused her father of giving up, of choosing pride over his family's need for him to stay alive. Frank countered that he was protecting them from the kind of debt that would follow them for generations. Dr. Hayes found herself in the impossible position of watching a good man choose death over bankruptcy while his daughter faced the prospect of losing him to a pride that had become indistinguishable from love. It was during this heated exchange that Dr. Hayes made a decision that would violate every hospital policy she'd ever been taught to follow. She'd been thinking about her father's stories, about the debt of gratitude that military families carried across generations, and about the oath she'd taken to do no harm. If Frank Morrison was the same Marine who'd saved her father's life in Vietnam, then she owed him more than professional courtesy. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, interrupting the family argument, "I think there might be another option." She explained that she wanted to research his military medical records more thoroughly, that there might be veteran benefits he'd never claimed, and that she was willing to postpone the most expensive procedures until they could explore every possible avenue for coverage. What she didn't say was that she was prepared to use her own savings and professional connections to ensure he received the care he needed, regardless of what the insurance companies decided. Frank studied her face with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read people's true intentions during wartime. "Why would you do that for someone you barely know?" Dr. Hayes hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only currency that mattered in this moment. "Because I think you might have saved my father's life in Vietnam." "And because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant beeping of medical equipment that had become the soundtrack of their crisis. Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment both women thought he might be slipping back into unconsciousness. When he opened them again, there was something different in his expression. Not hope exactly, but the willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, his story didn't have to end with him choosing between death and financial ruin. Thursday evening brought the kind of medical crisis that transforms ordinary hospital corridors into battlegrounds between life and death. Frank's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past 6 hours, his fever spiking to dangerous levels while the infection spread with an aggressiveness that alarmed even the most experienced nurses. Dr. Hayes had been monitoring his blood work hourly, watching his white cell count climb to numbers that indicated his 75-year-old body was losing the fight against whatever toxins were leaching from the embedded shrapnel. Sarah sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. During his lucid moments, Frank would squeeze her fingers and try to smile, but she could see the fear in his eyes, not of dying, but of leaving her and the boys with a mountain of medical debt that would destroy everything he'd spent his life trying to protect. The surgical team had been assembled for an emergency consultation that felt more like a war council. Dr. Hayes found herself arguing with colleagues who questioned the wisdom of attempting such a complex procedure on an elderly patient with multiple risk factors. The anesthesiologist was particularly concerned about Frank's cardiovascular status, noting that his blood pressure had become dangerously unstable as the infection progressed. "We're talking about a minimum 6-hour surgery on a man whose system is already compromised," Dr. Martinez explained to the gathered team. "The shrapnel appears to be embedded near the carotid artery and several major nerve pathways. One wrong move, and we could cause a stroke, permanent paralysis, or worse." Dr. Hayes studied the latest imaging results, her medical training warring with something deeper. A growing certainty that Frank Morrison was indeed the same Marine who'd carried her wounded father to safety during the Tet Offensive. She'd spent her lunch break calling the Veterans Administration, trying to track down military medical records that might shed light on Frank's original injury and why it had been left untreated for so many decades. The breakthrough came at 7 p.m., when a VA records specialist finally returned her call with information that changed everything. Frank's military medical file contained multiple references to shrapnel wounds sustained during combat operations, but a clerical error had resulted in his being classified as fully treated when he was actually discharged with retained foreign objects that were deemed too dangerous to remove, given the medical technology available in 1968. "Dr. Hayes, you need to see this immediately," the records specialist said, his voice tight with urgency. Sergeant Morrison was recommended for a Purple Heart and full disability benefits, but the paperwork was never processed. According to our files, he's been entitled to comprehensive medical coverage for service-connected injuries for over 50 years. Sarah was in the hospital cafeteria, forcing herself to eat a sandwich she couldn't taste, when Dr. Hayes found her with news that seemed too good to be true. The VA records revelation meant that Frank's surgery and all related medical expenses would be fully covered under veteran benefits he'd never known he was entitled to receive. More importantly, the VA hospital in Minneapolis had a specialized team that dealt specifically with retained combat shrapnel, cases exactly like Frank's. "There's more," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice carrying a mixture of professional excitement and personal satisfaction. "If we can get him stabilized for transport, the VA surgical team can have him in their OR by midnight. They've handled dozens of cases like this, and their success rate is significantly higher than what we could achieve here." But Frank's condition was deteriorating too rapidly for a routine transfer. His blood pressure had dropped to critically low levels, and the infection markers in his bloodstream indicated that sepsis was setting in. Dr. Hayes made the decision that would define her career. They would attempt to stabilize him for emergency helicopter transport to the Minneapolis VA Medical Center, where specialists waited with equipment and expertise that could save his life. The next 2 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between death and salvation. Frank was prepped for transport while medical personnel worked frantically to bring his vital signs to levels that would allow him to survive the 40-minute helicopter flight. Sarah found herself signing consent forms she barely understood, trusting that the medical team knew what they were doing while her father's life hung in the balance. At 9:30 p.m., the helicopter landed on Millfield General's small helipad, its rotor wash creating a windstorm that seemed to capture the chaos of the evening. Frank had been sedated for the transport, but as the medical team wheeled him toward the aircraft, he managed to grab Sarah's hand one more time. "Tell the boys their grandpa was proud to serve," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. "And tell them I'm sorry I kept so many secrets." Sarah ran alongside the gurney until hospital protocol forced her to stop at the helipad's edge. She watched the helicopter lift off into the darkening sky, its navigation lights disappearing into the distance like a star carrying away everything she had left to lose. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own sobbing and Dr. Hayes's gentle hand on her shoulder. The drive to Minneapolis in Sarah's aging Honda felt like a journey through purgatory. Dr. Hayes had insisted on following the helicopter in her own vehicle, and the two women spent the 90-minute trip in tense conversation about Frank's prospects for survival. The VA surgical team had a reputation for handling the most complex military-related medical cases, but Frank's age and the advanced state of his infection created variables that no amount of expertise could completely control. They arrived at the VA Medical Center to find a level of organized chaos that spoke to the seriousness of Frank's condition. The trauma team had been waiting for his arrival, and Sarah watched through observation windows as her father disappeared into an operating room surrounded by more medical equipment than she'd ever seen in one place. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead surgeon, emerged after what felt like hours but had only been 20 minutes to provide the first update. Frank had survived the transport, but barely. His vital signs had crashed twice during the flight, requiring emergency intervention that had pushed his already weakened system to its limits. The surgery would be even more complex than originally anticipated, with an estimated duration of 8 to 10 hours. "I won't lie to you," Dr. Walsh said with the directness that Sarah had come to appreciate from military medical personnel. "Your father is in critical condition, and the next few hours will determine whether we can save not just his life, but his quality of life. The shrapnel has been in place for so long that removing it will be like defusing a bomb that's been ticking for 50 years. Sarah found herself in another hospital waiting room, this one filled with other military families facing their own medical crises. She called Mrs. Patterson to check on Jake and Tommy, learning that the boys had been asking increasingly difficult questions about when their grandfather would come home. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that the answer might be never. Friday dawn arrived with the cruel indifference that accompanies life's darkest moments, filtering through the VA Medical Center's windows like a judgment Sarah wasn't ready to face. She'd spent the night curled in an uncomfortable waiting room chair, drifting between fitful sleep and wide-awake terror, while her father fought for his life 3 floors above in an operating room she couldn't see. At 6:47 a.m., Dr. Walsh emerged from the surgical suite with an expression that Sarah had learned to dread during her nursing career. The carefully neutral mask that medical professionals wear when they're about to deliver news that will shatter someone's world. Sarah's hands trembled as she stood to meet the surgeon, Dr. Hayes rising beside her like a guardian angel who'd already witnessed too much suffering. "We were able to remove the shrapnel," Dr. Walsh began, her voice carrying the exhaustion of an 8-hour surgery that had pushed every limit of medical expertise. But the damage was extensive. 50 years of metal toxicity has affected multiple organ systems, and the infection had spread further than our imaging indicated. The words that followed felt like physical blows. Frank's kidneys were failing. His liver function was severely compromised. The shrapnel removal had required cutting through nerve pathways that might never fully regenerate, potentially leaving him with permanent paralysis on his left side. Even if he survived the immediate post-operative period, he faced months of intensive rehabilitation with no guarantee of returning to independent living. "How long?" Sarah asked, the question emerging from some primal place where hope and despair fought their final battle. "If he makes it through the next 48 hours, we'll have a better sense of his long-term prognosis," Dr. Walsh replied with the honesty that military medicine demanded. "But I need you to understand that the Frank Morrison who went into surgery may not be the same man who comes out of recovery." Sarah's breakdown in the hospital corridor attracted stares from other families dealing with their own medical crises, but she was beyond caring about public displays of grief. This was the moment she'd been dreading since childhood, watching her father slip away from her just as her mother had, leaving her alone with 2 young boys and a future that seemed impossible to navigate. Dr. Hayes found herself making phone calls she'd never expected to make, reaching out to colleagues in Minneapolis who specialized in military trauma cases, searching for any experimental treatments or clinical trials that might offer Frank better odds of recovery. Her personal investment in his case had moved far beyond professional obligation into something that felt like family duty, a debt she was determined to honor regardless of hospital policies or insurance limitations. The financial devastation was becoming clear even as Frank fought for his life. Despite the VA coverage for his military-related injuries, the complications arising from 50 years of delayed treatment were creating gray areas that insurance reviewers would undoubtedly challenge. The estimated cost of his care was already approaching $300,000, with rehabilitation expenses that could easily double that number. Sarah found herself making impossible calculations in the hospital chapel, trying to figure out how to mortgage a house she was already behind on, liquidate retirement accounts she'd never had, or borrow against a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The boys needed her, but Frank needed her too, and there weren't enough hours in the day or dollars in her bank account to meet everyone's needs. The call from Peterson's grocery came at the worst possible moment, while Frank was experiencing complications that required emergency intervention. The manager's voice was apologetic but firm. Sarah's position had been filled by someone who could provide reliable coverage. After 3 days of absence, she was being terminated effective immediately. "I understand you're dealing with family issues," the manager explained, "but we have a business to run and customers expect consistency." The cleaning service had already replaced her, and the catering company had stopped returning her calls entirely. In less than a week, Sarah had lost all three sources of income while watching medical bills accumulate at a rate that made her previous financial struggles look manageable by comparison. Mrs. Patterson's phone call that evening brought news that pushed Sarah's emotional reserves past their breaking point. Jake had been sent home from school for fighting with a classmate who'd made jokes about his grandfather being crazy with that thing on his neck. Tommy had wet the bed 3 nights in a row and was refusing to eat anything except graham crackers. "They need their mama," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "and they need to know what's happening with their grandpa." But Sarah couldn't bring herself to drive home and look into her sons' faces while their grandfather lay dying in an intensive care unit. She couldn't find words to explain that the man who'd taught them to fish and build model airplanes might never come home, and that even if he did, their lives would never be the same. The breaking point came when Frank's condition took another turn for the worse. His kidneys had stopped producing urine, indicating complete renal failure that would require immediate dialysis. His blood pressure had become so unstable that he needed continuous medication just to maintain basic circulation. And the ventilator that was breathing for him had become a permanent fixture, not the temporary assistance they'd hoped for. Dr. Walsh's evening update contained the words Sarah had been dreading. "We need to discuss your father's wishes regarding life support. He never wanted to be kept alive by machines," Sarah whispered, remembering conversations from Martha's final days when Frank had made her promise never to let him become a burden to the family. "But he also never wanted to leave us in debt that would destroy our lives." The cruelest irony was that Frank's military benefits would cover the cost of keeping him alive indefinitely, but wouldn't necessarily pay for the kind of rehabilitation that might give him a chance at meaningful recovery. The VA system was designed to sustain life, not necessarily to restore it to the point where a 75-year-old man could live independently or contribute to his family's well-being. Sarah spent that night walking the hospital corridors, unable to sleep while machines kept her father's body functioning, and financial obligations accumulated like storm clouds on a horizon she couldn't avoid facing much longer. Saturday morning brought revelations that would rewrite everything Sarah thought she knew about her father's life, starting with a phone call that Dr. Hayes received while reviewing Frank's overnight vitals. The voice on the other end belonged to James Morrison, no relation to Frank, a VA benefits coordinator who'd been digging through military archives all night after Dr. Hayes' urgent request for a comprehensive review of Frank's service record. "Dr. Hayes, you need to sit down for this," James said, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic discoveries that could change lives. Sergeant Frank Morrison was recommended for the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and full disability compensation following his service in Vietnam. None of it was ever processed due to what appears to be systematic clerical errors and administrative negligence that affected thousands of veterans from his unit. "Dr. Hayes felt her pulse quicken as the coordinator continued reading from files that had been buried in storage facilities for decades. Frank's military record painted a picture of extraordinary heroism during the Tet Offensive, including multiple instances of carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. Most significantly, his final medical evaluation before discharge had recommended immediate surgical intervention for retained shrapnel, with a notation that removal should be attempted when safer surgical techniques become available. "The most important thing," James continued, "is that Sergeant Morrison has been entitled to full disability compensation backdated to his discharge date in 1968. We're talking about over $800,000 in retroactive benefits, plus comprehensive medical coverage for all service-connected conditions." Sarah was attempting to process this information while standing in the ICU corridor, watching through a window as nurses monitored her father's still critical condition. The financial relief was overwhelming. but it felt hollow when Frank remained unconscious and dependent on machines that were keeping him alive hour by hour. The second revelation came when Dr. Hayes began connecting the dots between Frank's military service and her own family history. She'd spent her lunch break calling her elderly Aunt Margaret, her father's only surviving sibling, to ask about Lieutenant James Hayes's service in Vietnam. What she learned made her hands shake as she took notes. "Your father talked about a Marine sergeant named Morrison for years after he came home," Margaret recalled. "Said that man saved his life during some terrible battle, carried him 2 miles through enemy territory after he took shrapnel to the leg. Your father always regretted losing touch with him." Dr. Hayes stared at the phone in her hand, realizing that the unconscious man fighting for his life 3 floors above was directly responsible for her own existence. If Frank Morrison hadn't risked his life to save Lieutenant James Hayes, she would never have been born. The debt of gratitude she'd sensed instinctively was actually a literal life debt that spanned generations. The third twist came in the form of a manila envelope delivered to the hospital by Martha Morrison's former attorney, who'd been trying to reach the Morrison family for months regarding unclaimed benefits. Inside were documents that Martha had filed with the VA shortly before her death, applications for widow's benefits and dependency compensation that had been lost in bureaucratic processing. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding not just benefit applications, but a letter Martha had written to her daughter, sealed and marked, to be opened only if Frank becomes too proud to accept help. The letter, written in Martha's careful handwriting during her final weeks, revealed secrets that explained decades of Frank's seemingly inexplicable behavior. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means your father is facing the same choice I faced during my illness, whether to burden the family with medical expenses or suffer in silence. I need you to know that Frank mortgaged our home, cashed in his retirement, and worked double shifts for 3 years to pay for my cancer treatments. He did this because he loves us, but also because his pride wouldn't let him apply for the veteran benefits he earned in Vietnam." The letter revealed that Martha had discovered Frank's military medical records years earlier, finding documentation of untreated shrapnel wounds and recommended disability benefits that he'd never claimed. She'd begun the application process secretly, hoping to secure financial stability for the family after her death, but the paperwork had been delayed by her declining health. "Frank carries guilt about surviving when so many of his friends didn't come home," Martha's letter continued. "He's never felt worthy of government help, even though he earned it with his blood and sacrifice. He saved other men's lives in Vietnam, but he's never been able to save himself from the belief that asking for help makes him weak." Sarah found herself crying in the hospital corridor, grieving not just for her father's current condition, but for the decades of unnecessary struggle he'd endured out of misplaced pride. The financial problems that had defined her childhood, Frank's reluctance to seek medical care, his insistence on handling everything alone, it all made terrible sense now. Dr. Hayes discovered Sarah reading the letter and gently took her to a private consultation room where they could process these revelations together. The VA benefits coordinator had confirmed that Martha's applications would be honored retroactively, meaning the Morrison family was entitled to additional compensation as dependents of a disabled veteran. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes said carefully. "I've been in contact with a specialist at the VA who deals specifically with delayed treatment of combat injuries. Dr. Patricia Kellerman has handled dozens of cases like your father's, and she believes his prognosis might be better than we initially thought." Dr. Kellerman's consultation, conducted via secure video link from Washington, D.C., brought the kind of hope that Sarah had stopped allowing herself to feel. The specialist had reviewed Frank's case files and medical imaging, concluding that while his recovery would be lengthy and difficult, the surgical team had successfully addressed the primary sources of infection and toxicity. Sergeant Morrison's case is actually quite encouraging, Dr. Kellerman explained. The human body's ability to adapt to foreign objects is remarkable, and the fact that he remained functional for 50 years with embedded shrapnel indicates an unusual level of physical resilience. With proper rehabilitation and the experimental treatments we're developing for Vietnam veterans, I believe he has a good chance of regaining significant function. The most shocking revelation came when Dr. Kellerman mentioned that Frank's case would be featured in a Department of Veterans Affairs study on delayed treatment of combat injuries. The study included a substantial compensation package for participants, essentially making Frank's medical situation a catalyst for research that could help thousands of other veterans dealing with similar issues. We estimate that there are at least 10,000 Vietnam veterans with undiagnosed or inadequately treated combat injuries, Dr. Kellerman continued. Your father's case could help us develop protocols that save lives and prevent the kind of suffering he's endured. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of their situation from financial catastrophe to unexpected stability. The retroactive VA benefits would not only cover Frank's medical expenses, but would also pay off the mortgage, clear Martha's medical debts, and provide security for Jake and Tommy's education. More importantly, Frank's participation in the veterans' study would give his suffering meaning beyond their family's personal struggle. But the most profound revelation was still to come. Dr. Hayes had arranged for Frank's military unit records to be reviewed by a Pentagon historian who specialized in Vietnam War documentation. The historian's preliminary report, delivered late Saturday evening, contained details about Frank's service that painted him as one of the unsung heroes of the Tet Offensive. According to military witnesses, Sergeant Frank Morrison had single-handedly rescued 7 wounded soldiers during a coordinated enemy attack, making multiple trips through hostile territory while under direct fire. His actions had likely prevented a complete unit massacre, but the chaos of combat had prevented proper documentation of his heroism at the time. "Your father didn't just save my father's life," Dr. Hayes told Sarah as they reviewed the historian's report. "He saved the lives of at least 6 other men, which means there are probably dozens of people alive today because of his courage. Families who exist because of what he did in Vietnam." The weight of this knowledge was almost overwhelming. Frank Morrison, the man who'd spent 50 years believing he didn't deserve help, had actually earned the gratitude of multiple families across America. The shrapnel that was slowly killing him was a badge of honor he'd carried in silence, too humble to recognize his own heroism. As Saturday night turned into Sunday morning, Sarah sat beside her father's hospital bed, holding his hand while machines monitored his slowly improving vital signs. The financial crisis that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier had been replaced by security she'd never imagined possible. But more than that, she finally understood the man who'd raised her, not the struggling widower she'd thought she knew, but a war hero whose greatest battle had been learning to accept the help he'd earned through sacrifice. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to believe that Frank Morrison might actually come home. 3 months later, the crisp September air carried the scent of changing leaves through Frank Morrison's kitchen window as he sat at the same table where this nightmare had begun. But everything about the scene had transformed. The man who'd once hidden his pain behind flannel shirts now wore a simple T-shirt that revealed the surgical scar on his neck, a badge of survival he no longer felt compelled to conceal. His movements were slower than before, his left arm still weak from nerve damage, but his eyes held a clarity that had been absent for years. Sarah bustled around the kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner for what had become a weekly tradition that brought together an unlikely family forged by crisis and revelation. Jake and Tommy set the table with the careful attention of children who'd learned that ordinary moments were precious gifts not to be taken for granted. Their grandfather's recovery had been measured not in dramatic medical breakthroughs, but in small victories. The first time he'd squeezed Sarah's hand, the day he'd spoken their names without slurring, the afternoon he'd managed to walk from his bed to the bathroom without assistance. Dr. Rebecca Hayes arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, as had become her custom, bringing her daughter Emma and a homemade apple pie that had become legendary among the extended Morrison family. The awkwardness of their first shared meal had given way to comfortable familiarity, built on the foundation of shared crisis and mutual respect. Emma and the twins had become inseparable, creating the kind of childhood friendships that often last lifetimes. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Morrison?" Emma asked with the directness of a 12-year-old who'd witnessed adult vulnerability and emerged with unusual maturity. "Better every day, sweetheart," Frank replied, his voice still slightly hoarse from months of medical procedures but warm with genuine affection. "And I keep telling you to call me Grandpa Frank." The transformation in Frank's circumstances was evident throughout the house. The leaky faucet had been repaired, the peeling paint touched up, and Martha's garden restored to something approaching its former glory. The VA benefits had provided financial stability the Morrison family had never experienced, but more importantly, they'd given Frank something he'd lost decades ago: the knowledge that his service and sacrifice had been recognized and valued. The weekly dinners had become a ritual of storytelling, with Frank gradually sharing memories of Vietnam that he'd kept buried for 50 years. The boys listened with fascination as their grandfather described the friends he'd served with, the villages he'd helped protect, and the moments of unexpected humanity that had sustained him through the darkest periods of the war. Dr. Hayes often found herself crying during these stories, recognizing descriptions of the father she'd barely known, and understanding for the first time why he'd struggled with demons he could never name. "Tell us about the time you saved Dr. Hayes's daddy," Tommy requested, as he did most Sundays, never tiring of the story that connected their family to Rebecca's in ways that felt almost mystical. Frank's face softened as he described carrying Lieutenant James Hayes through enemy territory, both men wounded and terrified, but determined to survive long enough to see their families again. He spoke of the promises they'd made to each other during that long night, to live lives worthy of their survival, to honor the friends who hadn't made it home, and to never forget that some bonds transcend the boundaries of military service. "Your Dr. Hayes' daddy was a good man," Frank concluded, reaching across the table to squeeze Rebecca's hand. "He would have been proud of the doctor you became, and the way you've taken care of all of us." Sarah found herself watching these interactions with wonder, seeing her father through new eyes that recognized the heroism she'd never understood. His stubbornness hadn't been mere pride, but a soldier's determination to protect his family from burdens he believed were his alone to carry. His reluctance to seek help hadn't been weakness, but the misguided strength of a man who'd spent his life putting others' needs before his own. The phone call that interrupted their dinner brought news that would complete Frank's transformation from hidden veteran to recognized hero. The Pentagon historian had finished his comprehensive review of Frank's military service, and the results were being forwarded to the appropriate authorities for formal recognition. Sergeant Frank Morrison would finally receive the Silver Star and Purple Hearts he'd earned 53 years earlier, in a ceremony scheduled for Veterans Day at the Minneapolis VA Medical Center. "They want to invite your whole family," the coordinator explained, "and they'd like Dr. Hayes to present one of the awards, given her father's connection to your service." Frank's reaction to this news was characteristically understated, but Sarah could see the emotion in his eyes as he processed the idea that his military service would finally be acknowledged publicly. For a man who'd spent decades believing he didn't deserve recognition, the prospect of standing before his family and community as a decorated veteran was almost overwhelming. The boys' excitement was infectious, with Jake and Tommy immediately planning what they'd wear to see their grandfather receive his medals. Emma asked thoughtful questions about military honors, while Dr. Hayes wiped away tears as she imagined presenting her father's fellow soldier with recognition that was 50 years overdue. As the afternoon wound down and their guests prepared to leave, Frank asked Sarah to stay behind for a private conversation that had been building for weeks. They sat together on the front porch where he'd collapsed just 3 months earlier, watching the sun set over a mill field that was beginning to show signs of economic recovery. "I owe you an apology," Frank began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of withheld truth. "I spent so many years trying to protect you from my problems that I forgot you might want to help carry some of the load." Sarah took his weathered hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses that told the story of a lifetime spent working for his family's benefit. "You don't owe me anything, Dad. You gave me everything you had, and then you found more to give. Your mother always said you were stronger than I gave you credit for," Frank continued. "She was right about that, like she was right about most things. I should have trusted you with the truth about my service, about the money problems, about all of it." The conversation that followed covered topics they'd never discussed. Frank's guilt about surviving when friends hadn't, his fear that seeking VA benefits would somehow diminish other veterans' claims, and his belief that a real man should be able to provide for his family without government assistance. Sarah listened without judgment, understanding finally that her father's struggles had been shaped by values that were both admirable and ultimately self-destructive. As darkness settled over Millfield, Frank and Sarah remained on the porch, planning a future that seemed brighter than anything either had imagined possible just months earlier. The VA benefits would allow Frank to help with the boys' education, and Sarah had decided to return to nursing school with a specialization in veteran care. Dr. Hayes was establishing a rural veteran health clinic with Frank's case as the model for identifying and treating delayed combat injuries. "Sometimes," Frank said as they prepared to go inside, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. I thought that bump on my neck was going to kill me, but instead it saved our whole family." Sarah smiled, thinking of Martha's letter and the chain of events that had led them to this moment of grace and redemption. "Maybe Grandma had something to do with the timing," she suggested. Frank nodded, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the clear Minnesota sky. "Maybe she did at that. Sometimes the burdens we carry in silence become the very keys that unlock our greatest blessings." Frank Morrison spent 50 years hiding his pain, convinced that asking for help would burden those he loved most. Like so many of us who came of age believing that strength meant suffering alone, he nearly died protecting a pride that was slowly killing him. But when that mysterious bump on his neck finally forced the truth into the light, it didn't just save his life. It restored his family, healed old wounds, and gave his grandsons a hero they never knew they had. Frank's story reminds us that the help we've earned through our sacrifices isn't charity. It's recognition of our worth. Whether it's reaching out to family when we're struggling, claiming benefits we've rightfully earned, or simply admitting that we don't have to face everything alone, there's profound strength in vulnerability. The greatest gift we can give our children and grandchildren isn't our silence about our struggles, but our courage to show them that asking for help is how families grow stronger together. Sometimes what feels like our greatest weakness becomes our family's greatest blessing. What burdens are you carrying alone that your family might want to help you shoulder? Have you ever discovered that asking for help actually brought your family closer together rather than pushing them away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.